There is a wooden spice rack mounted on the wall inside our pantry that has been there since Eleanor and I bought this house. For the better part of 4 decades, I treated that piece of wood as nothing more than a kitchen decoration. It held dozens of small glass bottles, most of them gathering a fine layer of dust, their contents slowly fading in color year after year. Growing up in Ohio, my father treated food purely as fuel for a long day of labor. The only seasonings I ever saw him use were a heavy shake of white salt and a light dusting of black pepper. When I moved into my own life and spent 35 years working in publishing, I carried that exact same philosophy with me. I viewed spices as something people use to simply make a bland piece of chicken taste slightly more interesting. I thought they were culinary luxuries, entirely disconnected from the actual machinery of human health. I am 77 years old now, and when I stand in the pantry and look at those little glass bottles, I feel a profound sense of regret. I realize now that I spent the majority of my life staring directly at a dormant, incredibly powerful biological pharmacy, and I completely ignored it. The body warns you before it collects the debt. I repeat that phrase to myself often, mostly because I spent so many years completely deaf to my own warnings. I assumed that because I was not sitting in a hospital bed, my internal environment was perfectly fine. I believed that cellular breakdowns, the terrifying diagnoses that seemed to catch everyone by surprise in their later years, were just a matter of tragic genetic luck. But when Eleanor faced a deeply frightening health crisis a few years ago, the illusion of that genetic lottery shattered for me. We were fortunate, but the sheer terror of sitting in those sterile waiting rooms changed the way I look at everything we consume. I stopped assuming I knew how the body worked. I retreated into my study, surrounded myself with clinical journals, epidemiological data, and pathology reports, and I started reading. I wanted to understand exactly what creates the environment where those devastating cellular errors thrive. I fully expected to find complex, highly engineered chemical solutions. I thought the answers would be locked away in expensive pharmaceutical trials. But as I read through the data, looking at what the most resilient populations in the world were doing, the clinical consensus kept pointing me right back to the kitchen pantry. I found overwhelming, verifiable evidence that the microscopic environment inside our bodies is dictated by the quiet daily messages we send it through our food. And the loudest, most biologically active messages do not come from the bulk of our meals, but from the tiny, concentrated amounts of culinary roots and bulbs we call spices. I realized that my absolute neglect of these specific compounds was one of the greatest blind spots of my entire life. I had wasted decades ignoring the very mechanisms that could have actively protected my cellular health. When I first started trying to correct this, I sat in my leather chair and made a list of every spice I could find in the clinical literature. But the sheer volume of information was paralyzing. There were dozens of them, all promising different miraculous outcomes. I realized that if I tried to overhaul my entire pantry all at once, I would become overwhelmed and eventually abandon the effort altogether. So I used the skill I honed over decades in the publishing world. I ruthlessly edited. I filtered out the noise, the internet trends, and the exaggerated marketing claims. I dug down until I found the 3 specific common spices that had the most profound, undisputed clinical backing for actively altering the environment where abnormal cells attempt to grow. The first one I brought back into my kitchen was garlic. For most of my life, I viewed garlic simply as a pungent flavor to be used sparingly so it wouldn't overpower a sauce. But when I read the pathology reports detailing what this white bulb actually does inside the human bloodstream, I had to stop and read the pages twice. I learned that garlic is arguably the most heavily documented culinary ingredient in the history of cellular biology. It contains a highly specific family of chemicals called organosulfur compounds. When I read about what these compounds do, it sounded almost like military strategy. They actively support the body's immune surveillance system. They stimulate the specific elite immune cells that patrol the bloodstream looking for microscopic abnormalities, making them more aggressive and more efficient at dismantling confused cells before they can anchor and grow. They also directly stimulate the liver, helping it flush out the toxins that cause those cellular copying errors in the first place. But what truly shocked me was discovering that for 70 years, I had been completely destroying the medicine before I even ate it. The clinical papers detailed a very specific chemical reaction. The protective organosulfur compounds in garlic do not actually exist when the bulb is whole. They are only created when the cell walls of the plant are physically ruptured. The crushing of the garlic allows two separate enzymes to mix together and create the active medicine. But here was my tragic mistake. That chemical reaction takes time. For my entire adult life, I would chop a clove of garlic and immediately scrape it into a hot pan with sizzling oil. The instant that garlic hit the heat, the enzymes were permanently destroyed. The heat killed the chemistry before the medicine could even form. I was eating garlic for decades and getting absolutely zero cellular benefit from it. Now my routine is entirely different, and it requires a patience I had to force myself to learn. I take a fresh clove of garlic, place it on the wooden cutting board, and I crush it flat with the side of my chef's knife. I chop it finely. And then, I do absolutely nothing. I push it to the side of the board. I set the timer on the stove for exactly 10 minutes, and I walk away. Eleanor used to laugh at me standing in the kitchen staring at the clock, but she understands why I do it now. Those 10 minutes allow the chemical reaction to fully complete. The compounds stabilize. Only after the timer goes off do I add it to whatever I am cooking, because once the compound is fully formed, it is far more resistant to the heat of the pan. I don't eat it raw, and I don't eat massive, uncomfortable amounts. I simply ensure that 4 or 5 days a week, a properly rested, chemically activated clove of garlic makes its way into our dinner. It is a tiny shift in timing, but it fundamentally changes the biological message I am sending to my immune system. The second addition to my daily routine was something I had rarely ever eaten in my first 6 decades of life: turmeric. It is that bright, staining, golden yellow powder that always seemed incredibly exotic to a man raised in the Midwest. I had heard people mention it casually as a remedy for sore joints, but I always dismissed it as folk medicine. Then I read a series of laboratory studies analyzing the active compound inside turmeric, a molecule called curcumin. What I found in those journals fundamentally changed my understanding of how cellular breakdowns actually begin. I learned about the concept of the low-grade inflammatory fire. As we age, many of us develop a quiet, chronic state of inflammation. It is a static hum of damage that we don't necessarily feel as pain, but it acts like gasoline for abnormal cellular growth. It creates a chaotic environment where healthy cells are constantly stressed, and where mutated cells are encouraged to divide rapidly and hide from the immune system. I read that the curcumin compound in turmeric is one of the most potent naturally occurring interceptors of those specific inflammatory pathways ever discovered. But it does far more than just cool the fire. The clinical data showed that it actively interferes with the chemical signals that abnormal cells use to communicate. It blocks their ability to build the rogue blood vessels they need to survive. And most remarkably, it promotes a mechanism called apoptosis. I had to look that word up. It means programmed cellular death. When a human cell becomes damaged or mutated, it is supposed to trigger a self-destruct sequence to protect the rest of the body. Abnormal cells figure out how to turn that self-destruct sequence off. The curcumin compound actually reaches into those confused cells and physically flips the self-destruct switch back on. When I understood the sheer power of that golden powder, I immediately went to the store, bought a jar, and started sprinkling it over my roasted vegetables and into my soups. I did this proudly for a month, thinking I was dramatically altering my health. And then I read the next chapter in the clinical journal, and I realized I was, once again, completely failing to understand the chemistry. I read about bioavailability. The human digestive tract is incredibly hostile to the curcumin molecule. If you simply eat turmeric powder on its own, your liver immediately identifies it as a foreign substance, metabolizes it rapidly, and flushes it out of your system before it ever reaches your bloodstream. I was eating the spice, but my body was absorbing almost none of it. The researchers explained that there is a biological lock, and you have to provide the exact key to open it. The key is a compound called piperine, which is found in simple, everyday black pepper. When you consume black pepper alongside turmeric, the piperine temporarily slows down the liver's ability to flush the curcumin, increasing the absorption into the bloodstream by an astonishing 2,000%. Furthermore, the curcumin molecule is fat-soluble. It will not dissolve in water. It requires a fat carrier to pass through the intestinal wall. So I completely changed my approach. I threw away the dry powder jars and started making a very specific, careful mixture. I take the golden powder, I add a heavy grinding of fresh black pepper, and I stir it into a small spoon of high-quality, cold-pressed olive oil. It creates a thick, dark, golden paste. That is the biological delivery system. I stir that paste into warm broths, or I mix it into the vegetables just as they finish roasting. It is not just about eating the spice. It is about guaranteeing that the spice actually makes it into the tissues that desperately need it. I am telling you these highly specific details because the difference between hoping a food works and actually knowing how to unlock its biological power is the difference between an illusion of health and actual cellular protection. I spent decades buying into illusions, and I don't want you to waste the time that I wasted. If you feel that this quiet, careful examination of the truth is something you value, I would ask you to take a brief second right now and check if you are subscribed to the channel. Many folks who sit down with me in this study every week aren't, and taking that small step helps me ensure this information reaches the people who might be standing in their own kitchens right now, doing exactly what I used to do, completely unaware of the medicine they are throwing away. The third and final spice I integrated into my absolute baseline routine is the one that has made the most profound, immediately noticeable difference in how I feel on a daily basis. Ginger. It is a strange, gnarled, pale root that I used to associate only with the ginger ale my mother gave me when I had a stomachache as a child. I never viewed it as an anchor for long-term cellular health. But as I kept pulling medical papers off the shelves, the research on this twisted root kept appearing, particularly regarding a deeply destructive biological process called oxidative stress. I had to spend several days reading to truly understand what oxidative stress means. The best way I can describe it is to think of it as microscopic rust forming on the machinery of your cells. As our bodies process food, encounter environmental toxins, and simply age, we produce unstable molecules called free radicals. These molecules are missing an electron, so they violently crash into our healthy cells to steal one, damaging our DNA in the process. Over decades, that accumulated rust, that relentless damage to the cellular blueprint, is a primary driver of the severe mutations that eventually become diagnoses. I read that the specific active compounds in ginger are incredibly dense, highly efficient antioxidants. They flood the bloodstream and voluntarily hand over electrons to those destructive free radicals, neutralizing them instantly before they can crash into our healthy tissues. Ginger is quite literally a rust-proofer for the human cell. But the clinical journals revealed another mechanism that convinced me I could never go a day without this root again. They detailed how ginger actively stabilizes the metabolic environment, specifically regarding insulin resistance. For years, I had a quiet fear about my blood sugar. I knew that high, chaotic levels of insulin in the bloodstream act as a powerful growth signal for abnormal cells. It creates an environment of biological panic. The research showed that the compounds in ginger actively assist the cells in utilizing blood sugar properly, smoothing out the spikes and crashes, and dramatically lowering the background levels of insulin. It removes the panic from the bloodstream. It takes an environment that is chaotic and hospitable to mutation and turns it into an environment that is calm, regulated, and stable. I stopped buying the dried ginger powder in the baking aisle. I go to the produce section now and buy the heavy, fresh hands of the raw root. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, when the house is quiet and the light in my study starts to shift, I perform a very deliberate ritual. I cut a thick slice of the fresh ginger root. I don't even peel it. I chop it into small pieces to expose the surface area, put it in a heavy ceramic mug, and pour boiling water over it. I place a small saucer over the top of the mug to trap the volatile oils that escape in the steam, and I let it steep for 15 full minutes. The water turns a pale, cloudy yellow. It is sharp, deeply warming, and carries a profound heat that spreads through the chest and settles in the stomach. I sit in my leather chair and drink it slowly. I can physically feel the settling of my digestive tract, but more importantly, I know with absolute certainty what it is doing to the microscopic rust and the metabolic chaos inside my bloodstream. When I first discovered all of this, my immediate instinct was to look for a shortcut. I am an American after all, and we are conditioned to believe that if a little bit of something is good, a massive, artificially concentrated amount must be better. I looked into buying heavily extracted garlic pills, massive doses of curcumin capsules, and concentrated ginger supplements. I wanted to bypass the kitchen entirely and just swallow a handful of pills every morning. But the deeper I read into the clinical literature, the more I realized how dangerous that modern instinct truly is. I found case studies of people, particularly those recovering from severe health crises, who became completely overwhelmed by the supplement industry. They were swallowing 20 different isolated compounds a day, trying to micromanage every single biological pathway. But human biology is not a math equation you can force into submission with isolated chemicals. When scientists extract one single compound from a plant and compress it into a pill at 500 times its natural concentration, it stops acting like food and starts acting like a drug. And the body often reacts to it as a disruption rather than a support. The clinical data showed over and over again that the profound protective power of these spices lies in the complex, untamed synergy of the whole plant. The turmeric root contains curcumin, yes, but it also contains hundreds of other trace compounds, oils, and fibers that all work together to buffer the absorption and guide the medicine to where it needs to go. You cannot replicate millions of years of botanical engineering in a plastic capsule. I realized that if I wanted the true protection of these plants, I had to respect them in their natural whole form. I had to return to the kitchen. It has been several years since I made these 3 spices the absolute foundation of my daily routine. I do not view them as magical cures. I have lived long enough to know that there are no absolute guarantees in this life, and I will not insult your intelligence by pretending there are. We all carry the echoes of our past habits, and we all face the inevitable realities of aging. But what I have gained is a profound, deeply comforting sense of agency. I am no longer a passive passenger waiting to see what genetic fate has in store for me. Every single time I stand at the cutting board, crush a clove of garlic, and force myself to wait those 10 minutes, I am actively building a hostile environment for abnormal cells. Every time I grind black pepper into that golden turmeric paste, I am actively shutting down the inflammatory fire that feeds disease. Every afternoon when I steep that fresh ginger root in boiling water, I am actively wiping the rust off my cellular machinery and calming the metabolic chaos in my blood. These are not dramatic, heroic actions. They are quiet, mundane, daily disciplines. But it is the relentless accumulation of those daily disciplines that dictates the ultimate trajectory of our health. You cannot undo the meals you ate 30 years ago. I certainly can't. I cannot go back and retrieve the decades I wasted treating my spice rack like a dusty museum exhibit. But the human body is an astonishingly forgiving machine if you finally decide to give it the exact chemical tools it needs to repair itself. Aging well is not about living in a state of terrified deprivation, and it is not about desperately seeking out exotic, expensive miracles. It is about having the quiet discipline to look at the simple, ancient tools sitting right in front of you, and finally learning how to use them correctly. I hope you will look at your own pantry tomorrow morning and ask yourself what kind of environment you are choosing to build. Thank you for sitting with me today. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you soon.